Let me ask you something. What happens when the most powerful man in the world issues a direct threat, and the people he's threatening just ignore him? Not secretly, not quietly, openly, defiantly, and then go on to build something worth over $1 trillion right in front of his eyes. That's exactly what BRICS just did to Donald Trump. And the numbers in 2026 tell a story that Wall Street doesn't want you to hear. Here's how this story starts. Back in November 2024, Trump got on his Truth Social platform and issued one of the most aggressive economic ultimatums in modern history. He told BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their new partners that if they dared to create a new currency or move away from the US dollar, they would face 100% tariffs. Not 10%, not 25%, 100%. He demanded, in plain language, a commitment from these nations to keep the dollar at the top of the global financial order. Then, on his very first day back in the Oval Office on January 20th, 2025, he doubled down. Standing before cameras, he looked straight at the world and said, as a BRICS nation, they'll have a 100% tariff if they even think about doing what they thought. They'll give it up immediately. That's not a warning. That's an ultimatum. And most people assumed BRICS would blink. They didn't blink. They built $1 trillion trade machine instead. Let's talk about what BRICS actually is in 2026, because the bloc that Trump is threatening is not the same small club that existed a decade ago. BRICS today has 10 full members: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, with Indonesia recently joining the New Development Bank. Together, this bloc represents roughly 45% of the world's population and controls an enormous share of global energy, food, and raw materials. And now, according to UNCTAD data, intra-BRICS trade has hit $1.17 trillion, a 13-fold increase since 2003. Let that number land. 13 times the growth. In just 2 decades. Trump called BRICS dead. The $1.17 trillion says otherwise. But here's where it gets really interesting and alarming, depending on which side of the dollar you're sitting on. That $1.17 trillion in trade? A growing portion of it is no longer going through the US dollar at all. China and Russia have essentially exited the dollar for their bilateral trade. As of 2026, roughly 90% of trade between those two countries is settled in rubles and yuan. No greenback involved. The Chinese renminbi now accounts for approximately 47% of all intra-BRICS trade transactions. Let that sink in. Nearly half of the internal trade of the world's most powerful economic bloc is happening in a currency that isn't the dollar. And BRICS Pay, the bloc's cross-border payment system linking Russia's SPFS, China's CIPS, and India's UPI, has already reduced USD usage in intra-bloc trade by roughly 2/3 compared to just a few years ago. 2/3. Gone. And it's not just payment systems. BRICS is building an entirely new financial architecture piece by piece, brick by brick, no pun intended. The New Development Bank, which is BRICS's own alternative to the World Bank and IMF, has already issued over $2.1 billion in loans denominated in local currencies, Chinese yuan, South African rand, and more. Its 2025-2030 strategy targets 30% of all lending in local currencies by the end of 2026. That means billions more in infrastructure financing that never touches the US dollar. Meanwhile, in October 2025, BRICS quietly launched a pilot of the BRICS unit, a gold-backed settlement instrument supported by over 6,000 tons of collective gold reserves held across member nations, with the unit backed 40% by gold and 60% by a basket of BRICS currencies. And while all of this was happening, global central banks were buying gold at a rate not seen in decades. In 2024 alone, central banks purchased 1,045 tons of gold, the third consecutive year above 1,000 tons, more than double the historical average from 2010 to 2021. China, Turkey, India, and Russia led the charge. The message was clear. The world's reserve managers are hedging against the dollar, and they're doing it with the one asset that no government can print: gold. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, okay, But is the dollar actually losing? Or is this just BRICS noise? Let's go to the data, because the data is brutal. In the year 2000, the US dollar made up 72% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2026, that number has fallen to roughly 58%. That is a 14 percentage point collapse over 25 years. And the pace is accelerating. The IMF's own COFR database showed a sharp further decline in Q2 2025, with the euro emerging as the primary beneficiary of dollar outflows. JP Morgan, one of the most powerful financial institutions in America, projected around a 3% dollar decline into mid-2026, citing both Federal Reserve policy and the growing pressure of BRICS de-dollarization efforts. The dollar is still the dominant reserve currency. Let's be clear about that. It's still on one side of 89% of all foreign exchange transactions, according to the 2025 BIS Triennial Survey. This is not a collapse. But what we are watching is erosion, slow, structural, and accelerating erosion of the dollar's unquestioned monopoly over global trade and finance. And here's the thing about erosion. It doesn't make headlines every day. It just keeps going. So what did Trump do when BRICS met at the Rio de Janeiro summit on July 6th and 7th of 2025? Right in the middle of all this, he issued another threat. On July 6th, the very day the summit opened, he posted on social media, "Any country aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions." 2 days later, he was back again, calling BRICS a group set up to degenerate the US dollar. BRICS held its summit anyway. Leaders discussed de-dollarization. They expanded the BRICS Pay system. They advanced the CBDC interoperability framework, India pushing for direct linkage of the e-rupee, China's digital yuan, and Brazil's DREX as a core agenda item for the upcoming 2026 New Delhi summit. They talked about a BRICS commodity exchange that could challenge the Chicago Board of Trade's price-setting monopoly on grains, potentially consolidating 30 to 40% of global crop trade under a non-dollar framework. The summit ended. The world moved on. And the dollar lost a little more ground. Now I want to give you the full picture here, because this channel doesn't do hype for hype's sake. The truth is, BRICS has real internal fractures. India and China remain deeply competitive, with unresolved border tensions casting a shadow over every summit. India's own Foreign Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, said clearly, "I don't think there's any policy on our part to replace the dollar. The dollar as the reserve currency is the source of global economic stability." Even Putin, in a candid moment, admitted, "We are not refusing, not fighting the dollar, but if they don't let us work with it, what can we do?" There is no unified BRICS currency coming in 2026. BRICS Pay is targeting a broader rollout by 2027 at the earliest, with a full settlement unit potentially not operational for intra-block trade until 2028 to 2030. The yuan still has capital controls that limit its global reach. And the US dollar, despite everything, remains the deepest, most liquid, and most trusted reserve asset on Earth. But here's what this story is really about. It's not about whether the dollar dies tomorrow. It's about the fact that for the first time in modern history, a credible trillion-dollar multi-continental economic bloc is building the infrastructure to make the dollar optional. Not illegal, not banned, just optional. And once you build enough parallel infrastructure, payment rails, local currency loans, gold-backed settlement units, cross-border digital currencies, you don't need to declare war on the dollar. You just stop needing it as much. That is what 1.17 trillion in intra-BRICS trade represents. That is what BRICS Pay reducing dollar usage by 2/3 represents. That is what 1,045 tons of central bank gold buying represents. It's not a revolution. It's a quiet, systematic trillion-dollar rerouting of global finance, happening right now in April 2026, while most people are still debating whether Trump's tariff threats actually work. They didn't work on BRICS. And the world is watching. If this video gave you a perspective you hadn't considered before, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want real analysis, not headlines. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the biggest shifts in global economics, because the story of the dollar and BRICS is nowhere near over. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the dollar can hold its position? Or are we watching the beginning of a slow-motion transition that will reshape the financial world as we know it? I'll see you in the next one.